Hello, history nerds. Welcome to the inaugural trip down the historic rabbit hole. We have a fun episode planned for you as a way to get to know Kat and I. The two of us actually met at our day job in the public library, but our friendship was cemented when we started talking about Broadway, specifically a little-known show called Six. There's a small group of us who have created our own queendom through the queens that we feel that most represent ourselves. Therefore, we are bringing you the history of our personal queens today for our first episode. On that note, hey Kat.
Yeah.
What do you know about my queen, Anne Boleyn?
I know a little bit about Anne Boleyn. I know the basic summary that Six kind of provides, and then just a little bit of deep, digging that I've done since then. But that's pretty much it.
Okay, well, we all do know the story that the rich white men of British history want us to believe. Anne Boleyn becomes maid of honor to Katherine of Aragon. Henry falls in love. They break England from the church. She apparently sleeps around while not giving Henry the son he wants, and then gets killed for treason so he can marry her second cousin. Forget about Bruno.
The gist of it.
Yeah, forget about Bruno. We do not talk about Jane Seymour on this podcast. I'm, though, going to give you a different story. I did a lot of research, and I found a story that seems to be a bit more realistic about the real Anne Boleyn, who actually died trying to make 16th century England a better place for everybody to live.
The kind of thing that easily gets swept under the rug when the winner is the bad guy.
Exactly. So I'm going to start with the basics, then get into the nitty-gritty fun stuff. There may also be a murder mystery involved.
Ooh.
So Anne was born sometime circa 1501 to 1507. It's unknown, as any records of her birth and stuff seem to be nowhere to be found. But facts about her teenage years actually makes 1501 the most likely year of her birth, which means that Anne and I would be about the same age, like as of this recording. Anne was the same age as me when she was murdered, probably.
Oh my goodness.
Which kind of is creepy.
1501, that was her theoretical date of birth?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, at least from like what we've seen, like her from her, like facts about her actual teenage years and stuff like that, that is the most likely year that she would have been born.
Gotcha, okay.
Her father was the first Earl of Wiltshire, and her mother was a daughter of nobility, as well as a lady in waiting to two queens. The most notable to this story being Katherine of Aragon. Anne was born in Norfolk, England. Fun fact, the family dog is actually a Norfolk Terrier cross. Probably should have named her Anne rather than Bellatrix, but hindsight. Before she then moved to the Netherlands to join the household of Margaret of Austria, who was a descendant of a Holy Roman Emperor. She stayed at this home in the Netherlands until her father got her a position in France, where she ended up being the maid of honor to two French queens. Everyone in France adored her, found her to be a dark-haired beauty with a brilliant mind. And it was actually there in France that she was exposed to the real reason of why the British men plotted against her.
Right.
When she returned to England, she had to actually find a way to keep her French independence while also fitting in with the court of a country that hated the country that pretty much brought her up.
Right, because England was more closely allied with Spain at the time, right? And there was like this whole thing between Spain and France, and England was kind of sucked into the middle of it politically.
Yeah, and I think just before Anne and Mary both kind of like came into like the British court, Frenchmen had actually murdered King Henry's uncle in cold blood and stuff, right? So
that had been recent. Okay.
Yeah, so the two countries weren't friends.
Yeah.
And France had very different ideals than England did.
Right, yeah.
Which we are going to see in Anne's story. Because now we get to kind of come back for the juicy stuff. In 1522, Anne came back to England for one reason. To marry her Irish cousin. His nickname was the Lame, not because of social status, but because of a war injury. But his real name was James Butler, 9th Earl of Ormond and the 2nd Earl of Ossory. His earlship over Ormond was actually quite a dispute in the family because their fathers fought hard over who had the right to that title. It was actually Henry's idea that the two cousins should be wed, as basically a way to stop the whole title dispute, as well as a favor to his friend Wolsey in order to keep James employed at that home instead of being sent back to Ireland.
Hold up, it was Henry's idea that the two get married?
Yes.
Oh, that's gonna be frustrating later. Okay.
Well, I mean, like, Anne's family was already kind of, like, part of the court, Because, like, her mom was working for the queen, and her father was actually, like, highly regarded by the king. And then, of course, Cardinal Wolsey comes friggin' in and is like, hey, I want to keep this guy who's part of my, like, home employment. I want to keep him, because if not, then he has to go back to Ireland. So let's just bring his cousin back over and marry the two of them.
Right, okay.
Very romantic.
Such sweet romance.
Yeah. But the title actually ended up going to Anne's father by 1528, and the cousins never actually did marry. Although there is there's nothing that tells us as to why they never got married.
Okay. Did they ever have, like, any kind of relationship at all then?
Not that is known.
Not that is known. Okay. No.
But James' story does have an interesting ending. He married a lady named Joan in 1830. Oh my God. Whatever year it is.
One of those centuries is correct.
1530. Had 7 sons before he was murdered by poison at a house party in 1546.
What?
Yeah, he was murdered. He, his steward, and 16 members of his household were all killed by poison at this party.
What? That's, like, how?
Well,
did they ever, like...
There's no formal investigation, but it is assumed that John Dudley, who was the host of this house party, decided to get rid of his competition, because then John Dudley got these titles from James Butler.
Oh my word. So how he was a nobleman. How is there no investigation into that? Like, that's
because he's a nobleman.
Oh, because Dudley was a nobleman?
Yeah. Like, so Dudley had titles, but he wanted more titles. And so
okay.
He was like,
Butler was a nobleman too, though.
Yep.
So they just, like, they just picked a side, and they were just like, well, okay, we'll brush it over for this guy, and then this guy's death can just go uninvestigated. Like, that's fine.
Pretty much. Although it was in, like, 1546. And I think like the Boleyn family probably was already at that point, like, in trouble.
Okay.
Right. He's, like, with the Boleyn family, so I don't think he was any concern anymore.
I gotcha. Because, so if that happened so you said, like, 1546, so that's, like, way later after, after Anne's gone and everything.
Yeah. So, okay. But you know what? At least Anne wasn't part of the whole murder scheme.
Well, that's true. I mean, at least she couldn't be thrown under the bus for that one.
Yeah. Then we have Henry Percy, who comes in because he's her next suitor. He is the son of Henry Percy, Earl of whatever. Daddy Henry Percy was an asshole who decided that his son's secretly betrothed wasn't in a high enough standing to marry a future earl. Oh, my word. Okay, so ironically, this random nobleman is like, yeah, Anne's not a high enough status for us, but then the king later is like, nah, she's fine. What? Exactly. The inconsistencies in the society, like, boggle my mind. Exactly, because I'm like, so Anne wasn't high enough on the social ladder to marry an earl, but we're supposed to believe that Anne and her father were like, hey, we're going to try it for the King of England. Oh my goodness. Which, to me, I'm like, that kind of shows that, well, no, there probably wasn't a plot to marry the King of England, because he's not the easy snatch if an earl was fused. Yeah, exactly. Like, she's got no power here. Like, there's no way that she could have ended up with Henry unless it was specifically because he was like, oh, she's shiny, I want that one. Like, yeah, that's kind of the only thing. Just Henry throwing all regard for everything to the wind and choosing her anyway is so much more, like, believable than this girl who doesn't have the status to marry an earl being like, you know what, I'm gonna seduce the king. Exactly. Well, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth later, like, if Anne and her father tried to seduce the king and it didn't work, then her entire family is going down. Oh, that's a good point. I never considered that. So they are, like, on that precipice kind of a thing of that, yes, they have the king's favor, but they're still not high enough class to really be meaningful of anything in this society, right? Right, okay. Now, my fun fact about Henry Percy Jr., he was on the jury of peers who doomed Anne to die. Of course. don't
He was on
understand.
the jury?
Yes, he was on the
like,
jury.
Wasn't he like part of the case? How was he?
No, he was
How
part
is
of
he
the
on
actual
the jury? What on earth? Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
historical men, they
real.
like to make sure that their exes are murdered in cold blood.
Oh, clearly.
Yeah, but...
Oh, hang on. So,
sorry.
and his name again was Henry Percy, right? Or was that Harry?
Henry Percy.
Okay. So between your story and my story, I think our lesson of the day is just avoid all men named Henry. I'm so sorry, but that's just like the running theme.
I agree. Like, fully agree. Now, Anne was not a seductress who wanted to marry the king for power.
Well, yeah.
We already know this, but...
You and I know this.
But when you look at their actual letters, and the letters that Henry and Anne sent to each other, she was actually trying her hardest to push the king and his advances away. His letters, pretty much in today's society, would be considered harassment.
Yeah.
What is ironic is that these love letters are actually held in an archive. At the library of the Vatican.
Interesting.
So they're holding the lovely quote-unquote love letters in an archive of the man that literally tried to split the country apart religiously and to say fuck you to the Vatican.
He really did. So the letters that Henry wrote to her, or she wrote back, or both?
Both. There's actually, well, mainly his to her.
Mainly his to her. And they, like, describe them as love letters?
Well, like, when we look at how historians have taken these letters, like, it's very much described as love letters.
Interesting. Okay.
Unless you actually look closely at the letters.
And, like, actually read them?
Yes. But I'd kind of digress a little bit. Anne actually wasn't keen on following her sister's stint as the mistress to the king. Many scholars and people at the time suspect that both of Mary's kids are actually the king's bastards, as there are no firm dates for the affair, and it's possible that she was sleeping with the king and her husband that she got through the king at around the same time frame.
Oh my goodness. I knew about one of them, but both of them, like, oh my goodness, girl.
And Anne also actually loved the queen and most likely had ideals that one shouldn't sleep with another's husband. The affair would have most likely ended in pregnancy, which Anne didn't have a husband to hide the child behind.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Mary could hide her child behind her husband, her children, if they actually were the king's. Anne had no one. And
not Anne's husband, Mary's husband was related to the king too, right? And they, like, without any DNA testing or whatsoever, anything like that, the best thing that they would have had was like, well, he looks like his dad, so it's probably his, right? So like, that's an extra layer of protection too.
Exactly. Considering that the king is the one that was like, hey, I have a man for you to marry. Now you can still be my mistress. Congratulations.
Yeah, there you go. We've secured your job security is, like, safe here.
Exactly. But the main reason that Anne would actually be opposed to an affair with Henry would be the fact that he was super against everything she stood for. As we said, she came from France, who had very different beliefs.
And she was vocal about them, too.
She was very vocal about them. And we all know that women are supposed to be seen as creatures that should be meek and mild, caring for their husbands without complaint. She was not. She was passionate and a very big supporter of evangelism. So he was actually a threat to her beliefs because just as she came to court is when he became the defender of the faith by the Vatican and, like, the Pope and all of those people.
Right. So he just got, like, a bunch of religious power and then, but, like, in a way that she wouldn't have agreed with.
Exactly. So once again, like, if she disagreed with the king, it would turn out pretty poorly for her entire family.
Yeah. Now, you couldn't be loud about that kind of stuff when it came to, like, the king unless he really, really liked you.
Which, through his letters, we could definitely see that he liked Anne.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to dispute the idea, though, that she might have helped force his hand to break England from the church. Because she was, like, evangelist. Like, she supported that whole thing. She actually was trained by, like the original Lutheranism, like, supporters in France. Like, she was actually allowed to have a voice in France, that she sat and learned and got to talk to people and understand what she was supporting.
Right, yeah.
So I could see for sure, like, I would be like, oh, hey, the king really wants my hand. He seems like super into it. Let's give it a try.
Mm-hmm.
What can I do to help push this agenda of like making the country better in a way?
Right, yeah.
Because she was educated in French courts that valued Reformation, including religious Reformation. So she probably saw him as somebody who was like, I'll do anything. Like, I'll do anything to get you in my bed.
Yeah. So she's like, I can use that and bring about religious reformation because this guy can't keep it in his pants.
Exactly. So she saw the opportunity to use his obsession over her as a way to help the English people. Because at this time, a little bit of a church lesson, people had such a fear of God and the church that the priests actually had an upper hand over pretty much everything, including people's health. It got to the point that the church was making money by having people pay for their sins rather than just pray to God.
Yeah, and the corruption in the church was just like absolutely like mind-bogglingly awful. Like it was so bad. It was like translations of the Bible in any religion outside, or sorry, in any language outside of the original written language was counted as heretical because they didn't want everybody to be able to read the Bible for themselves. They wanted them to have to take the priest and the bishop and the pope at their word. Yeah. Or like study for years and years and years and learn like Latin and Hebrew and like the original text and be able to read the original text. Like they didn't want people to be able to read it for themselves and think for themselves. And this is a whole thing that honestly I could do a whole other episode on. But like it was a mess. It really was a mess.
Well, and like on that same note, literacy wasn't huge, like wasn't big.
Exactly.
So basically the Pope literally stated that his authority was greater than the Bible. So one only had to listen to his priests and they would be listening to God, right? So it's like, don't even bother to try to read it in any language. Just listen to the priests. They're talking for me and I'm talking for God.
Exactly. And only the priests and like the church, like higher up, more educated people in the church would be the only ones who could read it. And therefore they would be the only ones who would know that like, that's not in there.
Well, I mean, like one of the slogans of the church was quite literally, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, at once the soul to heaven springs.
It hurts. Oh, it hurts. It's so bad. Oh.
So Anne would have seen all of this, and she had a soft spot for the lower class. Mm-hmm. So she would have want the Pope out of the way so that future reformations could happen.
Yeah, for sure.
Which basically means that, like, she had no choice but to finally say yes to the king's hand, because there's also, like, the king was actually starting to threaten the positions of her father and her brother. Right. So it's like, okay, in order, like, I have to save my family, but most likely also, but I can also do this.
Yeah, at least I can turn this into a better situation.
Yeah. I'm not going to go into, like, all the details of the stuff that Anne did, but one of, like, the most major things that she actually ended up doing was that she proposed a law that actually went through, much to Cardinal Wolsey's unhappiness.
Dismay.
Which was the Poor Law, which was a law that laid out free health care for the less fortunate, as well as a statement that governments had to find the poorer people employment opportunities.
Okay.
But everybody, like most of the men and stuff, right, who actually ended up being part of her execution, like the push for her execution, like were like, no, this is not a good law. This doesn't work for us.
Lovely. So did it end up being enacted then, or was it just like it was pushed through to a certain point and then it was just like cut off?
I think it got pushed, if I remember correctly from all the reading I did, it got pushed through. But then there were problems with it, and it ended up kind of getting, like, remolded. Because actually in Europe, like, well, not in Europe, but, like, in England, technically they have, like, free healthcare and stuff still for everybody.
Right.
But even right now, it's starting to get pushed more towards, like, the privatized healthcare. Like, they had, like, for the a long time, they've had, like, a mix of both.
Right, okay.
And so it's kind of going backwards now, where they're trying to do more privatized healthcare than the free healthcare, because their free healthcare is so overwhelmed. So they're trying to so they're trying to, like, I think, figure out still right now, like, as to what's going to be the best solution for it. But, like, it's still like that since then, like, this point, it's been like more towards free healthcare than it was.
Right, and that's in part because of Anne and this law that she got put into motion.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, so she kind of became clearly like in charge in a way, and was pushing the changes towards Britain. And then these more powerful men started to gang up on her, and she was basically, in my opinion, she was definitely murdered for being a radical, more modern thinker and a passionate woman. I think that the king, yes, was going to the side because he has a very short attention span, it seems. With his women, like that no matter what, there's gonna be a mistress. So he already was kind of like over his love affair for Anne and the obsession. But I don't think it would have gone as far as her being beheaded or whatever, the way that it did, unless these other men were like pushing at him and being like, hey, look, she's radical, she's making fucking changes, we don't like it, she's too passionate, she's gotta go.
I mean, that makes sense. I mean, Henry seems like he was very easy to manipulate. He seems, anytime he has a strong opinion, it's because it is coming from someone else, right? Like, there's always some other influence in his life, from everything that I've read anyway, from my observation. He's like, you know, he's super in love with Catherine of Aragon, so he's all in on Catholicism. He's super in love with Anne, so like Anne Boleyn, so he's like, okay, Reformation time. Like he doesn't he doesn't stand for anything on his own besides just like his immediate pleasure and convenience. Like he's so easy to use, right?
Yeah, when I don't think that like Reformation, great. I think it was like that she was smart enough to spin it as to like, hey, this is kind of like what I would like, or hey, like this is the only way this is going to happen. Like I want to be married to you.
Yeah.
Knowing full well that the church wouldn't give it to him, and that he would be like, I want to fucking marry this woman, therefore I will do whatever it takes.
Well, exactly. This is exactly what I mean, right? Like, he's like, he in Reformation, great as in like, not as him being like, oh yeah, super on board for the Reformation, but like, oh, this is how I get what I want, then yeah, sure, we'll do this like major political and religious change so that I can make you happy and myself happy. Like, that's what I mean. Like, it's not like he was ever fully like on board and like, oh yeah, Reformation. Like, he flip-flops back and forth like so often. It makes it like so confusing for everybody. Literally based on who he's with half the time. Like, it's like he doesn't actually care. He's just using it for his own like personal convenience.
Exactly. And that's like kind of like what I wanted to bring up about Anne. 'Cause like we all know, like most people know like the facts, like, but they don't know the behind the scenes and why she might have done some of it, which I'm like, let's look at this in a bit more of like a, hey, look who's writing this history. Let's actually look at the person that the history's let's living this history. And before we move on to your queen, I do want to mention that there's literally only one known image of Anne left in the world.
Really?
It's their face on a coin that is currently held by the British Library. There's a possible second painting of a woman that has never been identified, but there's not enough data to go on to say if it's actually Anne or if it's just that the two of them have a very similar look. Yeah. So like everything, like anything that we see of Anne is actually taken from like as like an artist rendition from this coin.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Everything else about her, including most of her letters, was all destroyed by Henry and the men that that basically got her to be executed.
Of course.
Except
I want to know what incriminating shit was in those letters that he burned. Like, why did he think they needed to be destroyed so bad? Was it just heartbreak, or was there some incriminating shit in there? Like, I need to know.
Well, considering he was probably, his hand was probably pushed to do it.
Yeah.
And at this point, Henry was still, like, the good-looking young king.
Right.
So so probably, like, the other people are like, oh, yeah, you need to destroy this because it's incriminating to all of us.
Yeah.
Although my dear nemesis, Cardinal Wolsey, kept most of the letters that Anne sent to him.
What? So he kept those, but he wouldn't let Henry keep...
anything else. Everything else. So, like, anything that could have exonerated her, gone.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Obviously. Because that's how you cover up a murder, is you get rid of the evidence. Oh my goodness.
So really, I actually brought you 2 murder mysteries in this.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, good gravy. Right. So to be clear, she was murdered for having like, well, according to the public court, she was murdered for having these like past relationships that were like condoned by the people they were supposed to be condoned by, and then just like twisted into being like this horrendous thing. And then one of them, wasn't she like, didn't they try to, or what was the word? Didn't they try to like pin one of her adulterers as like her brother, or like, how do I phrase this?
It
Like,
was
didn't
somebody
they
who
try
was
to
related to her. I think it might have been her brother Thomas.
was it Thomas or was it George Boleyn?
I think there's a Thomas and there's a George.
Okay, I think it was George because George came up in my notes because his widow comes up in my story.
Ooh.
And it was, it said that George Boleyn died, he had died because he was, I think, beheaded for being convicted of having an affair, or on charges of like adultery and incest, and for like having an affair with his sister, who was Anne.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I think that, like, when they were taking out Anne, they're like, we need to take out other people to
so just,
make
like,
our
threw him in
story
there.
more truthful to the public eye, right?
Right, yeah. But, like, how freaking bonkers is that? Is to, like, oh, what's that? She, like, has, like, a somewhat okay relationship with her brother. Let's just, like, go ahead and throw all these allegations at him, too. Like,
well, and they took, like, some of, like, Anne's, like, ladies, and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They were also basically, it was either that they weren't allowed to have anything to do with her and basically put on, like, a hush gag order, or they were also convicted with her, basically being like, we're going to need to tie up all of our loose ends.
Yeah, right. Oh my goodness. Yeah, they really went above and beyond to silence her. Like, I
mean, yeah, she was a powerful woman in a world of more powerful men.
True.
It's kind of like the mistress in France, Madame de Pompadour. Like, she also was very much like, hey, I'm just the mistress, but I'm going to use my power to fix my country.
Right, yeah.
And was kind of destroyed for that, too.
It's like, this is the kind of power that, like, a woman of that kind of time could have, was, like, acquiring it by marrying the right person and then using her influence in her marriage to actually affect any kind of change. Like, that was the power that a woman could attain at that time, right? Like, yeah. It's, I mean, automatically, like, comes off as manipulative out of context, but if you consider that that's, like, the only thing that they could do, it kind of makes sense. Like, if you had a passion to make a change and that was the only way that you could do it, like, wouldn't.
Well, and I don't think Henry actually fully ever got over her, because, I mean, his next wife was her second cousin, and Jane, and then he went across seas, and then he came back to another cousin of hers.
Yeah, that's true. It stayed in the same circle for like a while after that. That's true. That actually brings me to kind of one of my points with Catherine, is that there's actually a number of similarities between her and Anne. But in some ways they were very similar. In some ways that Henry would have liked, they were very similar. But in other ways, they were very, very different people as well. So, are you okay with moving on to...
Yeah, totally.
Have we discussed everything that you wanted to talk about with Anne?
Yes, I have.
All right. Well, then, Ashley, what do you know about Catherine Howard?
Probably the same as what you knew of Anne. I think, actually, even though I loved studying King Henry and his wives, like, a long time ago, Anne was, I think, Anne and Catherine of Aragon were the ones I knew the most about.
That makes sense, because those two are so interconnected and, like, relationships overlapped and stuff like that. Well, that makes sense.
And I think I found, like, a sort of, like, a kinship. Like, I kind of got myself hooked onto Anne. So I didn't know as much about the other wives. So, like, with 6, I'm like, great. Like, now I'm actually kind of more curious about the other wives, because I'm kind of seeing them in a bit more of a humanistic light than just as one of Henry's other wives that's not Anne Boleyn.
Yeah, fair enough.
So.
All right. Well, much like Anne, Catherine was born sometime between 1518 to 1527. I say that's like Anne because, like Anne, we don't have her birth certificate. Historians argue about when exactly it was, and it does matter because it gives additional context to her future relationships, which ended up being brought to trial, and that resulted in her final demise, right? So, like, it adds so much context to her life, and this age range, I'll repeat, is 1518 to 1527. That is a gap of 10 years. There is a huge difference between like either of those birth dates. So because basically what you have is you have some people saying that she married Henry VIII at 22, and some people saying that she married Henry at 13. Obviously, those are very different situations.
You've either got a child bride or
one of them is literally a child bride.
But neither, like, I would actually almost say that knowing the society, 13 sounds like the more realistic age.
Well, see, here's the thing, right? So at any point in that range, she still would have been the youngest wife. All of his other wives were in their mid-20s to 30s when he married them, right? Yeah. Range. So even if she was 22, she still would have been his youngest wife.
Yeah.
So, like, societal expectations aside, for Henry, it would have been hugely out of character for her to be 13.
That is true.
Because that is a big jump. So I don't think she was I don't think she was that young. One of my sources did say that it was normal for noble girls to be sent off for like kind of in the same way that Anne was, like sent off to be trained or like to be educated somewhere at like 12-ish.
Yeah.
Which adds to my thinking that I don't think it was likely that she was 13 because she was also sent off, like she was sent quite young, but she was also sent to her aunt's house. We'll get to that later for this kind of training. So we don't know for a fact. There are a couple of documents or a couple of wills that narrow down this range a little bit. One from 1524 from a relative that doesn't mention her but mentions her older brothers and sister, and another a few years later in 1527 that does mention her and her younger sister. So the theory is that her and her younger sister may have been not born yet or born too young for the first will, but old enough to be recognized in the second. So that kind of narrows it down. By that theory, narrows it down between kind of like 1522 to 1527. And I'm going to assume kind of leaning towards the 1524 range because it's kind of the average, sort of in the middle. It kind of makes it a little bit easier to understand what's going on by that date. And from most of what I saw had it kind of pinned around like 24, 23, 25. So I'm going to go with 24 as just being the median, just to keep things simple.
Yeah, like that totally makes sense. I know like with Anne, like that's why they're thinking like 1501 because she would have been about 12 when she would have been like put into these houses to be groomed, basically. And so right where they're like anything past that is almost like she'd be super young going into these houses.
Yeah. Which can happen. Like in Catherine's case, it did happen. Actually, she kind of had extenuating circumstances. She was born to a sort of deadbeat lord of a father, and her mother died when she was only a year or two after the birth of her younger sister, who would have only been a year or two younger than Catherine. So when she was probably around 4-ish, her mother passed away, and her dad was like constantly broke, right? Like he was known for being financially irresponsible. He was like constantly in and out of favor with the king and other nobility, and like that kind of ran down his family line too.
Yeah.
He married his first wife, who was Anne, who was Catherine's mom, not Anne's mom, who was Catherine's mom when he was still in favor. And she had already been married and widowed and already had 5 kids. And then she had 6 more with him.
Jesus.
And this man is broke.
That does not sound like a great childhood.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is a really unstable childhood. And then her mother passed away when she was like really, like I said, like 4-ish, 5-ish, when she was really young, right? And her mother was like kind of the wealthy one between the two of them, like in that coupling. And so like her dad's side of the family was like the Howard side. Like that was like the side that was like, unfortunately we're related to them half the time because they're always bouncing back and forth about whether or not they're favorable. But the mom side was like consistently powerful. So when the mother died, her name was, we see it written as Jocasta or Joyce, and she was a Culpeper. That name will come back later. When she died, Catherine and one of her younger brothers, like all the kids were essentially sent off to various places to begin their education. Catherine and one of her younger brothers were sent to her aunt, who was the Duchess Agnes of Norfolk, who is a wealthy, powerful duchess with a fantastic reputation. And she did this like all the time. She always had like girls coming in to be kind of trained and groomed and like educated.
Well,
she had a
Norfolk
reputation.
Is like the place for like the powerful people then.
Yeah,
like Anne was born in Norfolk,
like,
and then Catherine sent to Norfolk.
Yeah, so Catherine was sent to Norfolk. Things that she would have learned there, kind of the same things that I'm sure Anne would have learned, but probably like a little bit less because she was in England still. She didn't get to go to France, but she would have been taught kind of the expectations of court, how to sit, curtsy, etc., as well as like we think she was taught like reading and writing. Not sure how far academically her studies went, but she also would have been taught domestic duties like how to cook, bake, household management, all like everything that she would need in order to run a noble household, essentially, as nobility herself. Cool side note I found, she probably also would have learned from her aunt how to diagnose minor illnesses and how to make and administer herbal medicines because her aunt was known for it.
Ooh,
she was. And she was actually, what was it? One of my sources said that she was actually asked by some pretty like high up people in King Henry's court about like how to handle like the plague or like the plagues and the things like that were going around. So she was actually pretty well known for it. And I just think that's the coolest side note because generally the medical knowledge that women refuse not to learn, despite not being allowed to be doctors through so much of European history, is just a testament to me to our human desire to care for each other and women's adaptability during times of major power imbalance. Like, we weren't allowed in like English society at that point to pursue academia on our own, but we still refused not to learn how to take care of each other and how to take care of ourselves. Like that, like, it's so cool to me.
Well, yeah, because I mean, at that point, you've got you kind of have like the family traditions passed down that then you can teach to other people, where it's like, no, we're gonna friggin' be badass women even if you won't let us be.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, okay, it's the woman's job to care for the people in her household, then let me use all the tools at my disposal. Yeah. Right?
Like, you want me to be able to care for my husband? Well, if I cannot medically care for him while waiting for the male doctor to come,
exactly,
I'm not doing my job.
Exactly. And it's just like, it's just such like, yeah, it's very cool. It's just the drive to survive and like to survive and to do it well it really comes through in like just little things like that, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, back to the point. Yeah, Catherine probably would have had like a moderate amount of power over the other girls there because, and over the maids because she was the Duchess's niece. But the house was known for treating all girls in the Duchess's care the same, no matter what their status was. So she probably wasn't even now that she's in this like financially stable environment, she still wouldn't have been elevated to this like, oh, you can do whatever you want, like, you know, you're above anybody else kind of mentality. She still had this like down to earth, like, you're the same as every other person around you, no matter how poor they are, kind of mentality being pushed on her.
Probably better for her anyways. Like, that the other girls aren't like, who do you think you are?
Oh, exactly. It makes for a more well-balanced person to be able to like see someone else where they're at and not just be like, well, I'm above you. So yeah, the Duchess had some strict rules. Like, she would like lock the girls in their room at night, but she was also pretty negligent. Like, it wasn't that difficult for the guys to find the key. She was known for being strict, but she didn't actually keep the best eye on the girls. Okay. Is essentially what I mean by that. So by all accounts, Catherine picked up on her studies like well enough. Like, there weren't any notes saying that she was particularly a dunce in any particular area. She followed the societal expectations of womanhood very well. Like, she was much less outspoken than Anne was. She was very much meek. I don't know if I mention it later, but she was with Henry. Her life motto was, as he says, so it will be.
So very Princess Bride-ish of her, but like reverse situations.
Yeah. So I think I wrote it down somewhere. Where did it go? As he says, so it will be. And we're not sure if the king came up with that for her or if she came up with it for herself. But given the way that she acted throughout her life, like, it's consistent. So it very well could have been her motto from her own words. This is the part that she is similar to Anne. She was praised as being a fine and graceful dancer. Ooh. And beyond that, there wasn't much that she was like especially or outright praised for. She was praised as being very beautiful and very charming.
I think that's basically what women were praised for back then. Oh, you're pretty. oh, you're like a good temperament for me.
Yeah, that's essentially it. But she did carry a lot of charm with her personality. She seemed to be a very likable person.
Yeah.
So, and that stands for kind of a lot. Oh, there was one other note that one of my sources mentioned, that she loved animals and especially dogs. So that was
more.
kind of the one other note about who she was at this time. Like, she just seems like such a sweetheart. Like, so most of what we know from or know of her from this period is very much overpowered by the information about her first relationship. And this is because of the court case and everything that comes later. And it's also overpowered by what various authors think about her first relationships.
Okay.
So
I'm a little bit nervous now, but...
right? So what we know happened was that she was a young teen. Henry Mannix was her music teacher. Word around the manor was that she was rejecting him and he was pursuing her anyway. And he was quoted as telling a concerned friend of Catherine's that he had less honorable intentions than marriage with Katherine. These are things that we know about the relationship. Much also outside of this is speculation. Katherine did not appreciate hearing about this, and shortly after, the relationship ended. There is no evidence that they ever actually consummated the relationship, though Mannix would allegedly, I put in quotes because, you know, a lot of her story is like from word of mouth. She did not have like letters and letters and letters from him like harassing her. It mostly happened in person. But he would allegedly brag about her showing him her body, but the extent of her relationship honestly did not have much of an impact on her life. The point is that it happened. She broke it off. And he seemingly had a hard time taking a no from a teenage girl. He would have been older than her, but it's debatable as to how much older, because again, her birthday is her entire birthday is debatable. But the only birthday I found for him listed as his birth year being the 1515, which with our previous assumption would make him about 9 years older than her. Okay. So old enough to know better.
Yeah, no, definitely.
That's kind of my point.
And I think like having like that age gap definitely makes it so that he had way more power. Like even if he wasn't in like a power situation of his job being her teacher, he had the power of being older, and that more people would be like, we trust you, you're older than her, and also you're a male.
And when you're a woman and you're living in a society who's told that you have to defer to the men in your life, and like I said, her life motto later was, as he says, so it will be. When you're already raised to have this kind of mentality, and then this older teacher of yours is telling you to do things, and she's just a kid. Like, she's just a kid. But also, you know, power or no, he still should have known better, because he was below her in station and never should have touched her. Like, he should have known that she was completely off limits.
Yeah, but who was going to stop him?
Like, it was never going to happen. It never, like, should have happened. And his intent wasn't even to marry her, so he's just dishonoring her by touching her. And, like, it should have been completely hands off. Like, it never should have happened.
Well, no, but in that time frame, who was going to stop him, and who was going to be like, you shouldn't do that? Exactly. It would be more of a, hey, good on you. You got some higher class ass, basically, if we want to modernize their language.
Right. I mean, it seems from the book that I'm reading by Josephine Wilkinson, the one that you're lending to me, Catherine Howard, The Tragic Story of Henry VIII's Fifth Queen. She talks a little bit about how the other girls in the house were concerned for Katherine, and, you know, like I mentioned earlier, that the one of them asked Henry, like, hey, what are your intentions with her? And he said as much as, I have no good intentions with her. I just want to touch her. I just want to play with her, essentially.
Yeah.
So Things ended between the two of them. Never should have happened to begin with. And then shortly afterwards, she moved on. He had a really hard time with that. We'll see that in a minute. But she moved on and started courting another man who was also employed by the Duchess, because, like I said, she was very bad at, like, actually keeping an eye on what was going on in her house. And this was Francis Derham, who would have been the same age approximately as Mannix. So this is not much better. He was an usher in the house. He wasn't her direct teacher, at least. But there are also, like, so many conflicting accounts of what happened here. We don't know how long the relationship lasted, because the birthday would kind of, like, her birthday would kind of tie into those calculations, like if she was here for, like, how long she was even in the house, let alone how long this relationship lasted. But it appears to have lasted at least a few months. And as Katherine shared a room with the other girls in Norfolk, house, it was known among her companions that they were engaging in each other sexually. The girls were all, like I said before, right? Like all the girls were sleeping in the same room. They had multiple beds. They had multiple girls to a bed. And the Duchess would lock the key at night, and then some boy would come along and grab it and unlock the room, or someone would sneak by and like unlock the room and let themselves in, and then it would be kind of a free-for-all. The boys, it wasn't just Catherine. Like there were other couples that would be coupling up in this situation as well. It's just that Catherine was of a higher station and shouldn't have been engaging in it by everybody's standards, so she was kind of judged more harshly just for that, but she wasn't the only one doing it. And it was like kind of an open secret that this was a thing that was happening. Derham, among other accounts, claimed that the couple considered themselves to be married or in a pre-contract. They referred to each other as husband and wife by accounts of people that were there at the time. And they considered themselves to be in a pre-contract, which would have been illegally considered a marriage at the time. But Mannix was petty. Remember, I said he didn't get over it.
Yeah.
And he reported the relationship to the Duchess, who didn't approve because of their difference in status, because he's of the same status as Mannix and has just as little chance with her. And she ended up splitting them up by sending him away, like outside the country away, like gone away. So their relationship ended.
Yeah, so I'm like, so it's not even the fact that it's her niece at such a younger age with an older man, and probably not like the most consensual, possibly. Yeah. It's the fact that their status.
She's just worried that this will be a mar on her status. She is just worried that Catherine can marry higher and she'll be a mar on the family if she allows this lower status man to touch her. That's the problem here. Not that she's literally a child, literally a baby.
No, like it's their fucking status.
That's not the problem. No, see, at this point, like women were considered like sexual temptresses at the age of like 13 at this point, right? And it's basically just like, well, you're naturally like this, you have to reel yourself in, or like the men will come and take advantage of you. And it's like, wait, what? Like, hold up, make it make sense. Yeah. I thought kissing was like as far as you could go at 13, and you're telling me that like they thought 13-year-olds were sexual temptresses. Like, I'm like, this whole story just makes me lose my mind. No, the problem was that the men weren't of high enough status. If they were higher status, this would be fine. I'm getting sassy. But Catherine didn't stay in the Duchess's care for much longer, thank the Lord. Well, fortunately and unfortunately, but the year was 19. I almost did the same thing that you did. What century are we in?
Who knows anymore?
The year was 1540, and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, got a position for her as a lady for Anne of Cleves, who was on her way to marry King Henry VIII. She hadn't arrived yet, but her position was secured. So she went to court to start prepping for that. And this is probably around the time when she would have met Henry. And Anne of Cleves' relationship with him did not last very long. And by July the same year, Henry had arranged an annulment with Anne of Cleves, and rumors were spreading that he'd marry Catherine Howard, who was around 30 years younger than him. Still assuming Catherine's birthday was 1524, she would have been around 16.
So much prettier than Anna of Cleves, which was his whole shtick about, oh no, she's not pretty enough. Therefore, I'm going to go for the 16-year-old, who was probably in general, like, with their age, like the women's age gap. Yes, she'd be prettier because she's not as stained with age as you would be.
She's 16.
Yeah.
Because she's 16. Yeah.
Ay.
Yep. So basically he was going to marry Anne of Cleves for political reasons. She got there and he was embarrassed because she didn't recognize him. And then he starts going around saying that, like, hey, you don't look like the portrait that I had this famous painter who is famous for painting people accurately. You don't look like your portrait. Sounds reasonable. Sounds super, super legit. So he broke it off with her pretty quickly, like 6 months later. And rumors start going around that he's planning on marrying Catherine. Around this time, the French ambassador described her in a letter to King Francis I, who is King of France, as a lady of great beauty, daughter of Norfolk's deceased brother. So, like, lots of emphasis was placed on her beauty and her charm. Henry married her quietly on July 28th of that year and had the church acknowledge her publicly a couple weeks later in early August. Catherine was reported to be kind, gracious, and graceful. Her marriage with Henry at first seemed happy at the start, as they always do, and he publicly endowed her with gifts and displays of affection, and she just soaked it all up. Like, this was like her best life. She's thriving here. Considering she went from being trained up like essentially as a maid for the queen to being the queen herself with little to no public backlash. Like, this was not like Anne's situation where everybody favored the queen before her and now don't like her. This was like a completely different scenario where everybody like barely knew the queen before, and then this young pretty little thing comes up and everyone's just like, oh, like she's an absolute doll. Like everybody loves her. There's no public backlash for her coming into power at all. And it was like initially like a real Cinderella moment, and she was just thriving on the parties and the dancing. Like, she's just having a good time of all of it, right? And honestly, like, fair play to her. Like, if you went from being essentially working class to suddenly being the queen and all these parties were constantly happening, you bet I'd be on the dance floor constantly. The king was even reported as being the healthiest he had been in years. And in the best spirits. Like, he was very happy with her at the start. She actually also had a good relationship with Anne of Cleves, which probably helped with the public perception. Like, to the point that Chapuis, who was the Spanish ambassador, I think, said that Catherine received Anne at court, showing her the utmost kindness, and also wouldn't allow Anne to bow to her, even though Anne had lost her rank as queen and technically should have. So she was like super duper sweet. She had a really good relationship with the past queen, and like nothing happened in animosity. It could have been a really, really awkward situation, and they took it and they just like smoothed it over, and they did not have a problem with each other. She also gave Anne gifts of 2 dogs and I think a ring that she had received from Henry with his approval, and the two danced together even long after Henry had left. So they're here, they're ready to party it up. Like, they're having a good time. She also did what she could to have a good relationship with Henry's children. She often gave small gifts to her young cousin Elizabeth, and they seemed to get along really, really well. But Mary didn't get along with her wonderfully, which makes sense since Mary was actually older than Catherine was. Well, so Henry's oldest daughter was older than her.
Well, and like, when you think about it too, Mary's mom was very unhappy with her situation. So that would have probably rubbed off on Mary as well. Like, all of these other like stepmoms basically don't belong. It should be my mother up there.
Yeah, my mother should still be here and she should be the one in your place for sure. Yeah.
And I mean, she's also related to Elizabeth. They're related by blood. So Elizabeth probably would have been like, great, I don't care how old you are related to me, and I will take you in if you want to be my new mom.
Well, and this is the thing. Elizabeth had so desperately wanted a mom. Like, who had she had since then? She had the woman who replaced her mother when she was very, very small. Elizabeth was actually still quite young at this point too, right?
Yeah.
She had Jane Seymour, who was fairly short-lived and died. And then she had Anne of Cleves, who kind of showed up and then was gone again. And then she has this woman who's giving her little gifts. She's related to her. She's trying to be kind of a mother to her, or in some sort of way. It makes sense that Elizabeth would be especially being so young, it would make sense that Elizabeth would have this attachment to her.
Yeah.
It was theorized that, this is kind of a side topic, but it's been theorized that the reason why Elizabeth, when she grew up, took so long and hesitated for so long to get married was because she liked Catherine Howard, and she saw her get murdered essentially for marrying, quote, the wrong person, kind of, right? So it's been theorized that Catherine Howard's death left an everlasting mark on her and kind of marred her perception of what marriage was, and convinced her it kind of wasn't safe.
Well, considering her next real motherly figure had the same demise as her mother, right? So even if she was even though she was really young when Anne was beheaded, it's she would still have some of those memories in a way, from people's perception of her mom, and knowing what happened to her mother, and then having the same thing happen to the next woman that was kind enough to her and stuff, right? I also wouldn't want to put somebody through that, or put myself through that possibility if the man became higher power than me and was bye.
Right? Like, it makes total sense. Like, even if she was too young to remember it herself, she, like, as she grew up, she would learn it and it would still, like, affect her deeply. The young prince was very small, but I believe that she also, like, made an effort to, like, reach out to him and give him gifts as well. Mary and her, they had their back and forth spats. But they did, before the accusations came out around Catherine, they did seem to kind of come to some sort of understanding, and they were on relatively peaceful grounds. Chapuis, the ambassador that we had mentioned before, was kind of Mary's, not like official guardian, but he was kind of her strongest ally for like most of her life growing up after her mother passed away. And he didn't have any kind of problem with Catherine Howard. It's in all the things that he's written about her are more or less flattering or sympathetic. Even when it came to a particular spat between Catherine and Mary, that got to the point that Catherine was kind of like, she needs to apologize or I'm taking 2 of her maids away. He still kind of took like a neutral ground on that, and he still didn't like say anything about Catherine overreacting or being unreasonable or anything like that. And basically all that he said about it was that this happened. Mary says that she has figured out a way to placate the queen, and then they kind of smoothed it over and it was fine. So like that was the extent of that. It just comes across like she really was trying with these kids, even though she was, I will repeat, still a child herself. Yeah, so she wasn't a particularly political person. Unlike Anne, she was not very vocal about it, but she did still use her position to kind of take care of her people, in the sense that she arranged for land to be granted to her servants. She gave old friends positions in her household, including Derham, upon request, and begged the king's mercy on behalf of a number of nobility who otherwise would have been imprisoned or condemned. And she was very popular for being this kind of like voice of compassion for the king. One such example being Margaret Pole, who was the Countess of Salisbury. She wasn't able to secure her freedom, but she had heard that the elderly countess was cold in the Tower of London and obtained permission from Henry to send her warm clothing made by her own dressmakers. And so she was able to kind of keep her comfortable until she was like, she still ended up being executed, but she was able to keep her comfortable. And Pole certainly would have appreciated Catherine's compassion in a time when essentially no one else had any for her. So like things like this made her pretty popular in the eyes of the people. And her compassion was like a thing that she was very much known for. She really was like a lady's lady at the time. Like she ticked all the boxes of like what a proper lady should be. Like she knew how to be that. And it seemed like it came like pretty naturally for her.
So basically, Anne killed them with passion, while Catherine killed them with kindness.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. You know, Anne picked up her sword and like fought her way into like her rightful political place, right? Like she was ready to fight for herself all the time. Catherine very much was just like, oh, I'm here, like, sure, like, let's make the best of this. Like, she's just a sweetheart. She's just a sweetheart, and then someone made her queen. Like,
yeah, like she didn't ask for that, but she did what she could with what she was given.
Well, exactly. Like, she just seems like she's such a pleasant person, and like I would have loved to like meet her and just like have tea with her, you know? Like, she seems like the kind of person that she's just all good vibes. Like, you walk away from her and you just feel light. Like, she's just so lovely.
I'll just keep plotting the downfall of the church with Anne.
That's possible. She was also very conservative, like Catherine was, so she was actually quite different from Anne in that regard. She was more of a conservative Catholic, but she didn't like do much for the movement for or against. It was part of who she was, and she had some opponents because of that. Yeah, she was religiously conservative, so there was like a couple of people that like on the Protestant side that didn't like that she was in power, just because her being conservative and being Catholic naturally tends to cause Henry to lean a certain way, or like one way or the other, and probably had a role in like impacting the people's perception of the church and stuff as well. But she was never like vocally for or against anything politically. She barely had the opportunity to. Like, they were married for like a year before accusations started coming out, essentially, like roughly. So she did not have her moment in the same way that Anne did. And now we're pretty much caught up with where midnight strikes and Cinderella realizes that she actually married a tyrant and not Prince Charming. So the first hint that something was wrong happened when Henry asked Catherine why she seemed sad, and she asked if rumors that he intended to get back together with Anne of Cleves were true. There were rumors like this kind of bounced around a bit, but he responded by essentially telling her to stop thinking about it, and if he were to remarry, it wouldn't be with Anne, which is not super comforting.
Well, considering the only one left is his first wife.
Right? It's like, oh, don't worry. If I were to remarry again, it wouldn't be with Anne. It's like, okay, but you do still want to stay married with me, right? Like, that's kind of why she's asking. It's not really that she's worried that he'll get back with Anne. She's worried that he'll leave her. And her response, and his response was just like, oh, I won't get back together with her if we do break up. That's not comforting.
Well, no, and considering he has the reputation of
She's
a womanizer.
Wife number 5. Like, yeah. Like, he could have done better. He could have done better here. We don't know exactly what he said, but we know that was the gist of it. There was also an event a few months later in which one of her cousins was up for trial, and despite public outcry asking for him to be released, the man was sentenced to death, even though one of his comrades was given a pardon. It isn't actually known if this was a reflection of the king's relationship with the queen, but it doesn't bode well because, like, there was, like, a group of men that were, like, being sentenced, right? And of this group, one of them was the queen's cousin, and that wasn't the one that received a pardon. So it's like, all right, is she falling out of favor? Is her, like, did she plead for mercy here? Did she want that? Like, we don't really know. So, but you would think that the king would want to protect the queen's family. And in this case, he didn't. So it's got some implications. Catherine went with Henry on Progress, which is like on tour through their castles around the country. And it's like this whole big party. And everyone was reported to be happy enough that people started whispering that her coronation would be happening soon. But this was not the case. Instead, in late 1541, so like a year and a half after marrying the king, a random courtier named John Lascelles, who happened to be a devout Protestant, so a person who would not have liked that the queen was in her position, reported to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer that his sister, Mary Lascelles, had lived with Catherine at the Duchess of Norfolk's house and had told him all that she knew about her relationships with Manox and Derham. The same day, and the Archbishop was a Protestant as well, he also would not have appreciated that a Catholic was in the Queen's position. So, the same day that Henry ordered the churches to publicly thank God for Catherine, and this is the same Henry who called her a jewel among women, Cranmer gave Henry a letter disclosing Catherine's relationship with Derham, and an investigation was immediately ordered, and unfortunately, it did not clear her name. They questioned Manox and Derham, Manox confessing that he'd loved Catherine and thought it was returned, as well as reporting Catherine's relationships, as well as confessing to reporting Catherine's relationship with Derham to the Duchess. Derham admitted to sleeping with her, but said that they'd agreed to marry and essentially had a pre-contract, so they hadn't done anything wrong by this line of logic. All of that was like the way that things were allowed to be. That was a societal norm. That should have been okay.
But if they were considered married, would they, like, if that was enough to consider somebody as married, would that then have also made it so that the marriage between Catherine and Henry at that time wouldn't be like a legal marriage?
Yes.
Okay. Like, that should piss off Henry more than the fact that they slept together.
Probably, yeah. So the same thing kind of happened with Anne, where she had a previous relationship, they had a pre-contract, and that was kind of ignored when it came to the case, like the adultery case, right? That was kind of like swept under the rug, like, oh no, we're gonna ignore that part. We don't like that part. That part doesn't fit our narrative.
Yeah.
So in this case, he said that they had a pre-contract, and therefore he didn't see her as having done anything wrong. He didn't see himself as having done anything wrong. He was questioned by torture as well, though, and ended up attempting to prove that the relationship had ended before Catherine's marriage to the king by kind of throwing her under the bus and revealing that Catherine was having an affair with Thomas Culpeper, saying that she had rejected him as Culpeper had her affection now. So basically he was like, see, she's not with me anymore. She likes this other guy, instead of just being like, she said that like she wasn't with me anymore because she's with the king. He's like, no, she's not with me anymore because she's like this guy who's like a friend of the king's. Like,
Hang on, though, but isn't that the same last name as her mom? So wouldn't that also be a cousin of hers?
It is, in fact, a cousin of hers.
I'm like, I'm listening. I pay attention to things.
It is. I've got a family tree chart in front of me here. It is actually a distant cousin of hers. So her mom, Derham was also a distant, maybe that's a different Derham. I'm actually not sure.
There's too many similar names.
Yeah, Derham was also a distant cousin of hers. Everyone's related. Just everyone's related.
I mean, it is like the 1500s England, so everybody's friggin' related to everybody. Incest is just a thing.
Essentially, yeah. Nobility, am I right?
Mm-hmm.
Your family tree is a circle. So yeah, so instead of just saying that, like, yeah, our relationship ended because she married the king, obviously we would end our relationship when she married the king, he instead said, our relationship ended because she likes Culpeper now, and throws this other guy into it, as well as Katherine, and it's like, cool, thanks for that. You could have tied up this whole thing nice and neatly with a nice pretty little bow, but no, you had to open your big damn mouth.
Well, no, because it's a save yourself situation.
Right? So Culpeper, yes, was a distant cousin of Catherine's and a close friend of the king, as a matter of fact. They likely met when Katherine came to court. Before he would have met Katherine, get this, he had already been accused of rape and murder, but had been pardoned on both counts and was still close to the king regardless.
Because he is a male.
Pretty much, yeah.
It's a theme.
No, from the report that I saw, he raped a park gardener's wife, so another married woman, and then murdered a man, I think when he was trying to get away from the situation, if I understood it properly. I kind of, like, I was rolling my eyes too hard at that point to read. Like, I was like, you've got to be freaking kidding me. This is the guy whose, like, word we're going to trust over the queen. Okay, sure. Cool. Sounds reasonable. But yeah, was somehow so close to the king. After this line of questioning, her ladies were questioned, and they had no hard evidence. But they saw what happened with Anne and did not want to be like her ladies who ended up dying with her. And so they offered up circumstantial evidence, probably to save their own lives. Because, again, remember, this is not the first time that Henry has done this, and they were probably rightfully terrified.
Yeah, I would be.
Apparently, according to them, Katherine wasn't found in her bed late one night, and she once looked longingly at Culpeper. This was admitted as evidence that she looked longingly at Culpeper.
Was he holding?
That was enough evidence.
Maybe holding a puppy?
Murdered.
Like, and she was looking longingly at the puppy that he was holding.
See, like, yeah, no. I definitely understand that the queen would be looking longingly at a man who was pardoned for rape and murder. Like, I definitely the kind of guy that a queen would be looking longingly at. But regardless, supposedly, there were several occasions in which the couple used Jane Rochford, who you might recognize as George Boleyn's widow, as a liaison in order to meet privately. If they did have a physical affair, they were never caught in the act, and the circumstantial evidence was the only evidence, but it was enough to get her for a conviction.
Yes, because Jane would want to assist another queen with pissing off the king when she saw what happened to her husband and sister-in-law. Totally makes sense. Thing.
From what I recall, Jane Rochford actually took the stand against George as a witness and said that his relationship with Anne was like a little too close. So some people see this as like a poetic kind of karma, that she ends up dying in very similar circumstances, being like on the other end of the stick, essentially.
Yeah.
Not that those things are like actually connected, but some people see this and they're like, yeah, this is kind of karma.
How about we
like,
just don't murder our supposed loved ones?
Yeah, right? Like, maybe we just don't do that. Like, crazy thought.
Crazy, I guess, modern day thinking thought, but not really, because we have lots of modern day situations like this, but still.
And she ended up being the only one, too. All of Catherine's other maids were, like, cleared of the situation because they all threw her under the bus. But Jane specifically was mentioned by name, and so she ended up dying alongside Katherine. Yeah, so the only document that we have written by Katherine herself was actually a letter to Culpeper, but it isn't outright damning. It is short, so I wanted to read it here.
Okay.
In her own words, and you'll have to bear with me on this one. This is old grammar. This is old grammar, and it breaks my brain every time I try to read this. But Catherine Howard, from her own words to Culpeper, writes, Master Culpeper, I heartily recommend me unto you, praying you to send me word how that you do. It was showed me that you was sick, the which thing troubled me very much till such time that I hear from you, praying you to send me word how that you do. For I never long so much for a thing as I do to see you and to speak with you, the which I trust shall be shortly now. That which doth comfort me very much when I think of it, and when I think again, that you shall depart from me again, it makes my heart die to think what fortune I have that I cannot be always in your company. It, my trust, is always in you, that you will be as you have promised me, and in that hope I trust upon still, praying you that you will come when my Lady Rochford is here, for then I shall be best at leisure to be at your commandment, thanking you for that you have promised me to be so good unto that poor fellow, my man, which is one of the griefs that I do feel to depart from him. For then I do know no one that I dare trust to send to you, and therefore I pray you take him to be with you, that I may sometime hear from you one thing. I pray you to give me a horse for my man, for I had much ado to get one, and therefore I pray send me one by him, and in doing so I am, as I said afore, and thus I take my leave of you, trusting to see you shortly again, and I would you was with me now, that you might see what pain I take in writing to you. Yours as long as life endures, Katherine. And she has a PS. One thing I had forgotten, and that is to instruct my man to tarry here with me still, for he says, whatsoever you bid him, he will do it. Yours as long as life endures, Katherine. That's how she signs off. I see there being two ways to read this, right? I've read this like 5 or 6 times now. Either she is absolutely in love with him and all the allegations are true, or he has some major blackmail on her and she desperately needs to talk to him about it. Like, this is the most passionate that we've seen her.
Definitely could be either way. I mean,
this was sent before the investigation started during her tour when she was like away with the king. So I could see this being like a you're keeping your promise not to rat me out, right? Kind of way. Or I can see this being like, I can't stand being without you, I need you so bad kind of way.
But I mean, it could also like even still be like a friendship-y thing, right? Like,
it could still be like a friendship-y thing.
Cause I'm like, I pretty much would be like, I friggin' need to be with you. I miss you so much to my friends. Right?
Like, there's a lot of ways that this can be taken. She says near the beginning, she says, I've received word that you were sick and it's troubling to me. She also says, basically, I really, really need to talk to you. And it comforts me very much to think about being able to talk to you soon. That's a great comfort to her.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
she says, it makes my heart die to think what fortune I have that I cannot always be in your company. So it's the most devastating thing to her that she can't always be with him, but that her trust is in him. She mentions Lady Rochford here, Jane Rochford, and says, for then I shall be best at leisure to be at your commandment, which could be, that could be romantically, that could mean literally like at his every like beck and call because he knows some shit on her, which is entirely possible. There's a lot of ways that this could be read. History doesn't always, because of like what we think what happened is going to taint a lot of the time like how we're going to perceive it. Exactly. Unless we had Katherine saying, I'm just friggin' friends with the guy. Exactly. We aren't ever going to know for a fact what their relationship was, but there's definitely something suspicious going on when she's talking about things like, there's no one that I dare trust to send you. So I went out of my way to get this man that I'm like, she's sending this man to be kind of her liaison for her, right? Yeah. So she's like, I've gone out of my way to find this man that I can trust to send word so that you can send word back. He says that he'll do whatever you say while he's with you. Just like, please get him a horse so that he can come back to me quickly and carry word quickly. So there's some kind of secret messaging going on. There's some kind of something going on that's kind of suspicious. But we're never going to know what it actually was now. Yeah. Like, she died before she could ever, like, fully tell her story. And even when she was alive, no one listened to her. Well, no, she was a woman. Yeah, exactly. It's just heartbreaking. Like, it's like there was clearly something. And we'll never know what it was. Culpepper was questioned, and he actually denied having a relationship with Katherine. But he did admit that he wanted one. According to both parties, nothing physical happened between the two of them. When Katherine was questioned, now it's finally her turn, now that everyone else has been questioned except for her. When Katherine was questioned, she apparently went into a panicked frenzy so bad that Archbishop Cranmer, the guy who was investigating her, ordered that her room be cleared of anything she could use to hurt herself with when he left her. She was this upset. And this is just when he came to talk to her, and he said that he started with the intent of saying that he was going to like lay down the law and tell her what she did and how dare she do it, and then talk about the king's mercy and have like this flood of relief at the end of it to try to get a confession out of her. But when he went in to talk to her, she immediately was so panicked and so frenzied that he started with the king will have mercy on you, or the king has shown mercy to you, and this is how the king has shown mercy to you. And Cranmer detailed like this entire conversation in a letter to the king, kind of like explaining what happened. And she essentially replied that knowing of the king's mercy only hurt her more because the king had this mercy on her, and this is what she did. And like she was just like completely beside herself.
Well, looking at her husband's track record, I'd be freaked the heck out even if I didn't do anything.
Right? Like, this is the thing. Like, but also she's like talking to the guy who's talking to the king, and she knows this, right? So like, you're not like, you can't just tell him that like he's gonna kill me anyway. I don't care if he says that he's gonna be merciful. I'm going to die. Like, you can't. But she's like in such a panic, and she's just like so completely beside herself that she's just like, she's so beside herself with complete and utter panic that in the letter he says, I found herein such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature, so that it would have pitied any man's heart in the world to have looked upon her.
Yeah, but Henry's not gonna care.
No, but you know, he really did try with this letter. Like, it really does shine the most sympathy on her. And it's like, even though this man was like a religious rival of the queen in a sense, like even though they came from opposing sides, he really does treat her with the most sympathy here. And that just kind of goes to show like how respected and how loved she was.
Yeah.
Like, this whole thing came as a shock to Henry too. He did not expect this of her whatsoever. Like, he thought that initially when he first got word of this whole situation, he thought that it was just a rumor. And then the investigation turned out that there was like some kind of history, and then they had to dig into that. So yeah, so she's being questioned. She's in this like crazy headspace, and I mean, honestly, rightfully so. And she denied to the death that she ever had a pre-contract with Derham, even though that could have provided the only loophole that could have saved her from her charges of adultery. Kind of like we talked about before, if she had a pre-contract with Derham, then her marriage to the king wouldn't have been valid, and therefore she couldn't have been adulterous to the king, and therefore she wouldn't have committed treasonous adultery. It would have been just normal adultery, and that's fine. It's at least not deadly. So regardless, she always said that part wasn't true. Now, the king could have just ignored that technicality like he did with Anne, but like it would have been it would have given them something if he was in better humors with her, whatever, like it would have given him something to like kind of allow her mercy. Cranmer also wrote in the letter to the king that Catherine said during questioning that she never sought Derham's affections, like she never wanted them, but that, quote, all that Derham did unto her was of his importune forcement and in a manner violence, rather than of her free consent and will.
Poor thing.
Yeah.
Like, I feel for her, especially if she's like admitting that, hey, I didn't want these advancements, but congratulations, I got them.
Yeah. And like under these circumstances too, like, can you imagine? Okay, so she's 16, 17, 18 maybe now, in that range. Can you imagine something like that happening to you when you were 13, 14, 15? If anybody's listening right now, I'm sure somebody can, and I'm really, really sorry. But having that happen, and then not only having that happen, living in a society that tells you literally everyone believes that it's your fault and that you did something to deserve it. And then growing up, having the Cinderella moment, thinking everything's going to be fine, it's in the past, you know, you're keeping people quiet, and it comes up again, but now it's treason, even though it happened before you met the king, and your head is on the chopping block. Like, the grief, the trauma, like, I just, even if they didn't see it the same way culturally, like, emotionally, the impact that has is devastating. It's like, all I can say is that, like, these are Catherine's words when she is absolutely beside herself with grief for this situation, right? Like, she's described as being in a frenzy. She is doing everything that she can to pull herself together, and this is the only thing that she can just like say to describe the situation. It could be a final grasp at freedom, but a pre-contract would have been an easier out than accusing someone of rape, right? If her goal was to just get out of the situation, she could have just gone with what Derham said and said, oh yeah, we had a pre-contract, but she didn't. But what she did say was that it was not willful and that it was not consensual. And that says a lot to me. It's tough because we have so little documentation about her life. These exchanges didn't happen over letters, they happened in person. And so we don't have like written evidence about what the relationship was and what it was like. And that's tough. It's literally only a he said, she said. But when she says it like this, I'm inclined to believe her.
Yeah. Well,
no matter how it looked to people, like when it was happening, that doesn't mean that it wasn't an incredibly manipulative situation. You know, just even just because of the way that society saw it, she could have been so vehemently against it while it was happening and even still had people thinking that it was consensual because everybody assumed that she wanted it, she deserved it, or she was asking for it because she was getting it. I just feel so much for this poor girl who, you know, she did everything that she could to be a good woman by society's standards, to be a good queen, to be compassionate, to be kind, to be generous. And no one listened to her. She was taken advantage of by her own understanding, by her own words. And what does society do with her story? They take her and they call her all kinds of terrible things. They make it out that she was a sexually promiscuous woman, and like she maybe had 2 boyfriends in high school and she didn't want them. That's hardly a sexually promiscuous woman. And even if she was, she's also a very compassionate woman. She's also a very generous woman. She's also a very graceful woman. She also has skills and loves and dreams and things that never got to be realized because her life was cut short because the king has an ego. There's another part of this story as to how it got so far as her death. And that is that the king was no longer young and pretty. The king was older, and rumors were already starting to very, very quietly spread about him possibly being impotent and unable to have another son. People thought at the beginning of his relationship with Catherine that he would leave Catherine and go back to Anne of Cleves when Catherine didn't immediately have a child. And they thought that he was essentially just bouncing from queen to queen at this point, just like, give me a son, no son, okay, next. And like running out of time. What does it say about a man's stamina if his teenage queen has to go somewhere else to get her sexual needs met? Not great things.
Nope.
And so there is a theory that part of the reason why that this went the way that it did was because Henry's ego was very, very publicly bruised in this situation. Whether the situation was what they said it was or not, that's what it would have looked like to people. And he absolutely could not have that. She was not the only one that ended up dying in this situation, though. Mannix got off scot-free, of course. Derham and Culpeper were both tried for treason and pled guilty. They were given the opportunity to plead guilty. I'm just going to emphasize that. Derham was hanged, drawn, and quartered, and Culpeper was beheaded because he was a nobleman. Derham wasn't, so Culpeper got the more, shall we say, tidy mode of death. Catherine never had a trial, or at least she was never given a chance to defend herself in court. A council decided that she was guilty of treason without her having a chance to speak up for herself. She was beheaded alongside Jane Rochford for being part of the conspiracy, and she was described as looking ill as she approached the block, but her final words followed the common script of the time, basically saying the court was just, the people should pray for the king, and her actions should reflect on her family, and proclaiming her faith that accepting her physical punishment would allow the Lord to have mercy on her soul, essentially. More or less. Whether she actually believed what she said, who knows? But the people looked on her compassionately even after her death, even after these outrageous claims against her. The people still held compassion for her, and she was described as being courageous for keeping her composure. Basically, Henry threw away what could have been a really, really magnificent queen. And my heart just breaks for her. This world has such a shortage of compassionate leaders, and she could have been one. And she was cut short because some guy who knew her before she even met the king decided that he could have whatever he wanted whenever he wanted it. It's just egregious, man. Like, and for her story, her absolute tragedy of a story, for it to like be taken by historians and be turned into this whole debate as to whether or not she was like seeking it, like, yeah, like she's so much more, right?
Yeah. What we noticed in the musical as well, like with the final kind of a thing with Catherine Parr, right? Like that history has one opinion of it, but they aren't all what history says that they are.
Exactly.
And I think we see it, like, not just with women of history, but even with, like, some of the men of history, or just, like, the groups of history, right? And I think that's what we're kind of aiming for, I guess, with this podcast, is to look at the other sides. Side. Like, yeah, and, like, being able to be like, okay, let's look at them with a human perspective, and not just with what the victors of, or the people who've decided the history have decided is what happened.
Exactly. History is told by the winners, and the loser's story is just as important, if not more so. Shouldn't even be the losers. The loser sounds like a harsh way of saying it. The victim's, like, story, like, also matters. And it can be so difficult to find. Like, we have so little documentation on Katherine Howard. We've got this, we've got this one letter from Cranmer to the king that I've been quoting. We've got her letter to Culpeper. We've got very little else. She's mentioned in a couple of places. I mentioned Chapuis, the ambassador, mentioned her a few times favorably. But it's hard to paint, like, a full picture of who a person was from just, like, these few things that we have.
Yeah, and, like, I had the same with Anne, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the fact that most of her side was destroyed.
Yeah.
That's, like, you have to really look into the nitty-gritties to figure it out.
Exactly. And, like, same thing with Anne and with Katherine, is, like, their version of events is never, like, fully gonna be, like, explored because it's gone. And what we have as a result is a lot of court documents talking about how they're definitely for sure guilty, because that way Henry could discard them. His ego was bruised in one way or another by both of them, and he didn't want them anymore, so he found a way to get rid of them. Heavy note. I'm sorry.
Heavy note. But then I don't think next week is going to be any lighter when we would talk about Bonnie Parker and Anne Bonny. Both
it'll be so much lighter.
So much lighter.
I mean, yeah, it's in some ways. We'll try to bring the fun to it where we can, where it's respectful. Because that's the thing. Catherine's life, she faced hardship. She grew up poor. She grew up being ignored and, like, neglected and being told that her no didn't count for anything. But she had that one little glimmer, and that's why I kept emphasizing it. She had that one little glimmer of light where she got to live out, like, being the queen. She got that one little glimmer where she was partying with nobility, where she was dancing, where she had the dogs, and she had the gifts, and she had the jewels, and she had the things. She had that one shining moment, and it did not last long enough. But I think that if her life had been longer, that would have been her joy, right? Like, I think it would have been from enjoying these lavish parties and, like, taking care of people and being the voice of compassion for the king whenever she could get away with it. I think we would have seen more of that, and I think we would have seen her mature into that role as well. I think it would have been a beautiful thing to see. So, what are our lessons for today? Our lessons for today were avoid men named Henry because they will stab you in the back.
Don't piss off men in general.
Don't piss off men in power. Men in power. Choose your men wisely, people. This is what we're going with. Just, be careful about the people that you let into your life.
Keep backups.
Back up everything. Screenshot those texts. Screenshot those emails. Keep a journal. Leave a record so that history will remember you the way that you want to be remembered. Leave a record behind. Yeah. There we go. That's our lesson.
I think it's a good lesson.
Oh, yeah. It's always an interesting thing to see, like, who people were and then how they were remembered, because those are so often not the same thing at all.
And I think we're definitely going to, like, get more into that with next week. So, yeah.
All right. Well, now we know a little bit more about Anne Boleyn and Katherine Howard.